Okay, welcome to part two of our lesson about unifying Canadians. We had just talked about immigration, how our policies have changed to incorporate more different types of people. We're going to take a look at now Canada's Constitution and how we've tried to kind of satisfy all different cultures through our Constitution. So the situation with our Constitution in the late 80s and 90s is that Quebec still hadn't really been consulted about our Constitution. So in 1982, Pierre Trudeau, he had repatriated our Constitution. He kind of gave it back, kind of put the power back in our own hands of how to change the Constitution. But when he did this, he had talked to all the other premiers, but he didn't talk to Quebec. So Quebec was still kind of unhappy about not having their input into the Constitution they had. They were pretty much forced to take it. Luckily, at the time in the late 80s and early 90s, there is a pro-federalist Liberal Party that's in power in Quebec, which means they are willing to talk to the federal government and willing to kind of keep Quebec in Canada. So that was good in the sense of trying to make Quebec happy. The rising problem at the time, though, is what's happening in the West, and we talked about this with the oil crisis in the 70s. So the western provinces, all the prairies and BC included, we're starting to feel that the federal government is focusing more on Quebec's issues and trying to make them happy versus what's going on in the West. There's an example that's in your textbook about how to fix up the Canadian Air Force and their planes. The federal government chose Bombardier, so kind of based in Quebec, a company based in Quebec, to fix up the planes. They gave them the contract versus I think there's another company somewhere in the prairies that could have done it too. So it always seems like the federal government was trying to make Quebec happy and not the West. And so in the West, you actually have the Reform Party forming to fight for the rights of the provinces in the West. So by the time we get to the late 80s, we have the Meech Lake Accord, which is Canada's attempt to change the Constitution and to finally get Quebec's say in our Constitution. So we have Brian Mulroney and progressive conservatives in power. They're thinking about kind of updating this Constitution. And beforehand, it was pretty much a liberal government that created the Constitution. Now the conservatives pretty much want to kind of have their say in how we build this Constitution as well. So what was proposed is that Quebec would be recognized as a distinct society. That's a key term. What that would mean is if they're a distinct society, they would have possibly even like a separate set of laws that apply to them, right? To pretty much protect their culture and their identity. Other things that they want to change in the Constitution was to give every single province the power to veto any changes to the Constitution. So that would mean all provinces have to agree to a change in the Constitution before anything gets changed. If one disagrees, one uses that veto power, no change gets made. There are proposed changes to the Senate and how you become a senator. There are changes proposed to the Supreme Court of Canada and how it's structured, and even more changes coming to the immigration policies that were proposed. And then the list kind of goes on. Meech Lake, by the way, is just close to Ottawa over here. And so here's how Canadians felt about the Meech Lake Accord. In the background, you see written on the wall, it says Meech all over the place, so it's kind of like everyone's talking about Meech Lake, or at least the news would be talking about Meech Lake. And then you have the two gentlemen in the front, the one on the left says, all this talk when a billion Chinese couldn't care less about Meech Lake. And the guy on the right, never mind 21 or 22 million Canadians who also don't care about Meech Lake. Another cartoon that kind of shows our attitude towards it. On TV there, you have a newscaster saying they're going to have more coverage of the Meech Lake Accord, but the guy watching TV would rather watch the hockey game. The Meech Lake monster here, that's Brian Mulroney caricatured as kind of Frankenstein. So it's kind of like what he created by revisiting this Constitution. So what happens to the Accord is that it pretty much falls apart. Manitoba and Newfoundland didn't support it, so they didn't ratify it. They didn't agree with it. Aboriginals didn't agree with it. They saw that Quebec was getting special treatment, that they would be recognized as a distinct society. So Aboriginals wanted that as well. So they pretty much wanted to change the accord to kind of allow Aboriginals to have that distinct society. There was also concerns that if Quebec got the recognition as a distinct society, they might use this against minority groups within Quebec. So in other words, it gives too much power to French Canadians, and anyone who's not French Canadian living in Quebec, they would suffer through this. The result, so the Meech Lake Accord doesn't pass. The result is there's going to be a growing sense of this desire for separatism in Quebec. So it kind of sounds like here's Quebec's only or first chance to kind of have their input into the Constitution, and the rest of Canada really doesn't care to listen to them. So there's going to start to be that idea that maybe Quebec should really separate and deal with things on their own. And to promote that idea of separation, you get the formation of the Bloc Québécois after the Meech Lake Accord. By the way, in Quebec, most people were satisfied with the reforms because they would get that designation as a distinct society. So on the cartoon on the right, you can see what the Meech Lake Accord has done to Canada. Has pretty much pulled it all apart. So there's Lucien Bouchard. He is the founder of the Bloc Québécois Party. He was formerly a member of the Progressive Conservatives, but because of the Meech Lake Accord, he leaves the Progressive Conservatives and forms the Bloc Québécois to kind of push the agenda of separatism. So Canada doesn't give up. In 1992, they try again with the Charlottetown Accord. The Charlottetown Accord really is a response to the failure of the Meech Lake Accord. They do it differently, though, this time. Rather than just kind of proposing all these changes and putting it out there for Canada, they set up a citizens forum to listen to, and it was pretty much done across Canada, to listen to the opinions of all Canadians and what they want in the changes to the Constitution. So they pretty much asked Canadians what they wanted in this. And their new set of proposals, not too different from the Meech Lake Accord, but the Senate would still be changed, and what they're asking for is to have an elected Senate and to have equal representation. So each province would get the same number of senators. So that's what they're asking for. Aboriginals would get the right to self-government, and that would be in our Constitution. So again, Aboriginals kind of get their say this time. More provincial control over forestry and mining and resources. They want to also harmonize telecommunications across Canada. So rather than having companies in the west or companies in the east, it would be kind of one Canadian telecommunications company that kind of runs the media in Canada. So that would be telephone and it would be telephone, radio, and TV at the time. Quebec would get its distinct society, and what this meant in the House of Commons is that if the Charlottetown Accord went through, they would always get 25% of all the seats in the House of Commons to protect that distinct Quebec society. So no matter what the population is, and no matter where the population is concentrated, Quebec would always get 25% of seats. So this time they hold a national referendum in 1992. So people actually go out and vote on this. And Canadians voted no. 54.3% voted no. In BC, 68.3% voted no. The yes provinces were Newfoundland, PEI, New Brunswick, and Northwest Territories. The problem with it? Just too many different clauses trying to appeal to too many different people. You're trying to make everybody happy, but when you kind of give certain rights or things that'll make one group happy, and you give them certain things, other groups start to complain about that. So if one group is happy about it, another group's not happy that other group kind of gets an advantage, and then vice versa. So it was just too difficult to try to get everyone's wishes kind of into the Charlottetown Accord, or at least to be happy with it. Sorry about that. The failure of the Charlottetown Accord fuels this Quebec nationalism even further. So, the second attempt to try to make Quebec happy and to kind of have their wishes in the Constitution. Again, Canadians vote that They're not willing to listen to what Quebec wants. The other effect you have of the Charlottetown Accord is this is the last time any government would touch the Constitution again. They saw how it pretty much tore the country apart and made everyone kind of angry with each other. And no government ever since wants to do that again, because you lose a lot of popularity based on that, right? Because you're pretty much asking people what they want, and then whatever they want kind of favors them but doesn't favor someone else. So it kind of starts to rip the country apart. Governments are always afraid of reopening that constitutional issue ever since the Charlottetown Accord. Here you can see kind of Quebec's attitude towards this referendum in 1992. There's Quebec on the right here. You can see their suitcase all packed. There's a fleur-de-lis on it. They're all packed up, ready to go, while the rest of Canada pretty much stays behind and kind of argues with each other. You can see the Meech Lake Accord here. You can see the Constitution 1982 there. So in 1995, kind of fed up with these two failed attempts to get their say in the Constitution, Quebec decides to hold their own referendum about separation. The premier at the time, Jacques Parizeau, he calls for a referendum on full sovereignty. In other words, Quebec would become its own country. This was all based again on the two failures of the previous accords, right? That Canada doesn't seem to be willing to listen to Quebec, so best option is to separate. Results of this referendum, 49.4% said yes, 50.6% no. So that's how close it came to Quebec actually separating in 1995. That was very close. What this sparked was a clarity bill from the federal government. So the federal government got pretty much afraid of all this, that they're actually afraid that Quebec would separate. So when they created the clarity bill, it meant that it's not just a simple majority that's going to get Quebec to separate. Like 50% plus one is not going to be enough for Quebec to separate. What they wanted was a quote-unquote, and it is vague like this, a clear yes majority. So what that means is they'd actually have to discuss it in the House of Commons as to what clear meant. Like if it's 60% or 67% or whatever else. It has to be clear in their mind that a majority of people in Quebec want separation. So this actually kind of works against the separation movement, that it got so close and then it scared the federal government, so they create a law that actually makes it a little bit harder for Quebec to separate. The other part of the clarity bill, though, is that if they do decide that it's going to be a clear majority for Quebec separation, Canada is then obligated to discuss how they will get Quebec kind of separated from Canada. So the Quebec referendum actually dies too. And here's Jacques Parizeau here. Here's his flat tire that has separation written on it. So that movement of separation pretty much dies down after this referendum in 1995. By the time we get to 2006, to deal with that issue of Quebec as a distinct society, Canada still doesn't recognize Quebec as a distinct society, but what they've done in 2006 is to create a motion in Parliament, so in the House of Commons, they pretty much make a statement that they'll recognize Quebec as a nation within Canada. So a nationality or a culture within Canada. So it's more of a policy, it's not law or anything, but what they'll do is any kind of discussions they will have in the future will take into account that the people of Quebec are a distinct culture, not necessarily with any distinct rights. Okay, so what you should be able to do is to use these four things at least, are the changes to our immigration policies, the Meech Lake Accord, the Charlottetown Accord, the Quebec referendum in 1995, and you should be able to take all that into account to assess whether or not Canada is a model of a successful multicultural country. So you think about how Canada is reacting to mainly these three, and I guess with the Quebec referendum as well. All these four events, how's Canada reacting to this? And does that mean Canada is being a successful multicultural country?